time for takeoff.
Squall of Fury. You dare to gaze upon me?
The Wanderer is finally here, and I'm sure most of us are going to call him something else. I'm probably going to call him Mr. Moosh. We've been waiting 2 whole years for this character to come out, and he's finally playable, albeit he's a little bit different from what we remember, but he still looks super fun. So today, I want to bring you guys the best Wanderer guide with all of the information that you need and none of the stuff you don't. We're going to be talking about what he does, what artifacts he'll use, what weapons he'll use, how you can build teams for him, and so much more. As a heads up, this whole video uses C0 Farozon, and for most clips, I have a 4-star catalyst on Wanderer. I also don't have his best in slot set equipped because I ran the domain, no joke, 400 times and couldn't get a decent artifact. So this guide will be extremely relatable and achievable damage-wise. No need to wail. If you enjoy this video, consider subscribing to the channel and leave a nice comment down below with something you learned or any questions you might have. With all that being said, my name is Braxophone and let's talk about Wanderer. So Wanderer is one of the most fun characters I've played and the first character in Genshin that can perform aerial combat. So in this section, I want to explain what makes him good and how he works. First off, for his burst, he literally steps on you. He takes out his foot he probably hasn't washed in weeks and stomps on the camera, or a little off to the side of it. It deals 5 instances of animo damage, costs 60 energy with a 15-second cooldown, and can hit fairly hard, but due to him not generating much energy when you're in his elemental skill, it's not something you need to worry about building a bunch of energy recharge on him for. You will just use it every other rotation or once every 3 rotations. It's strong, but it's not so strong that you absolutely have to use it all the time. Next up, you know that thing that Aether yells? Windblade? Yeah, he does that. His normal attacks shoot out wind blades, and his charged attack is a large AoE that can be spammed over and over. Now, when you use his skill, he starts to hover and gets basically what's a new stamina bar. The stamina bar is draining the whole time he's in the air, but while it's up, he's got a multiplier on his normal and charged attacks that increases his damage. You can fit a ton of charge attacks into a skill window, and it makes him able to output a ton of AoE damage over a short time. Just look at this. Without Hydro buff, I hit 13 charged attacks in that one window. And if I took my blindfold off, I could probably hit 14 or 15. Alternatively, we'll talk about this later, but he has the ability to be a normal attack carry with a signature weapon or other characters to buff him. He also can move around while airborne, though if you sprint or elevate yourself, it takes extra stamina. Now, something you absolutely have to know about Scaramouche is that his stagger resistance basically just doesn't exist. In the air, if you take a hit from basically anything in the game, you'll have to recover. Basically, this just means that you have to have a character that gives stagger resistance or a shield. He is borderline unplayable without a shield. Spending too much time dodging makes his damage lower, and he's squishy just due to him being a standard scaling character, so playing him with a shield is almost always a must. Another thing to know is that his skill attacks count as normal and charged attack damage, not elemental skill damage. Only the initial hit that goes off counts as skill damage, and if you use Scara's burst while he's in his skill, it will also end the skill. Now, when you get Wanderer leveled up, you'll eventually get his second passive. Basically, what this is gonna do is give you a chance to spawn animo arrows when you start sprinting in flight. They call it acceleration, but it's just when you dash. The way it works is every time you attack while in his skill, you get a chance to activate the effect, and when it activates, the next time you sprint, the animo arrows will go off. The longer you go without proccing the effect, the more likely it is to happen. It encourages dodging with him. It's not going to completely compensate for the damage you lose, but it makes it so that it's not as detrimental. His first passive also plays into his skill, where it gives you a buff based on whatever elements you come into contact with. The buffs are pretty solid and they play into team building, which we'll talk about later. The Hydro buff gives him an increase to the stamina bar he gets for his skill, Pyro gives him a 30% attack buff, Cryo gives him a 20% crit rate buff, and Electro gives energy back to Wanderer when normal and charged attacks hit enemies. To get the most out of his burst, you're going to want to make sure to use it when you have these buffs up, which basically means as soon as that stamina bar is about to run out, that is the time to burst. Now, one last thing to keep in mind before I give you talent priority is that the buffs that he gets depend on elements he comes into contact with. So it's not dependent on the team you build, but rather the ability to give yourself contact with an element. You won't automatically get Pyro for having Bennett in your team. You'll have to actually stand in Bennett's burst at one point or be floating above Bennett's burst to get the Pyro. As far as talent priority goes, prioritize his normal attacks first, since that's where the bulk of his damage comes from, even with his skill active. Then you can choose to level his burst or skill next. I opt for burst, but leveling his skill is more helpful for him than it is for a character like Yoimiya. You're probably gonna triple crown him anyways, so it doesn't really matter. Wanderer is pretty sick, but because he sort of fills the roles of hypercarry or driver, you need to build him a very specific way. So next up, let's talk about artifacts. I'll get the easy part out of the way first. For players below AR45, just focus on attack percent on your sands, animo damage or attack percent on your goblet, and attack percent or crit on your circlet. After AR45, for any players building Mr. Moosh, your goal should be attack percent sands, animo damage goblet, and a crit rate or crit damage circlet. Technically, if you're getting the cryo buff on him and you're using a crit weapon, you could get away with a really strong attack circlet, but I would recommend aiming for a crit rate or damage one. For energy recharge, I mentioned it before, but you don't really need to use his burst every rotation. There's not secondary effects other than it ending his skill, so you can try to get about 130% in substats, but it's not worth investing main stats into. The more complex part has to do with what artifact sets you want to farm. Before AR45, you can opt for something like Martial Artist, Berserker, or any attack percent set, but I want to talk about after AR45. The thing is, with Wanderer, you have different team options that can make different sets better, and he's a character that absolutely wants a 4-piece set effect. The new Animo set, Desert Pavilion Chronicle, is going to be his best in slot for personal damage, especially if you want to use him as a carry without off-field damage dealers. It gives an animo damage buff as well as attack speed buffs and normal, charged, and plunging attack damage. If you're using him as a hyper carry or in a team with other animo users, this is the set that I recommend. However, if you're playing him with off-field damage dealers, 4-piece Viridescent Venerer is likely going to be the best. Not only is swirl damage incredibly strong for characters that attack often, but it also debuffs enemy resistances, which will increase your team's total damage, even if it lowers Wanderers by comparison. Outside of those two sets, you have some backup options. I really hate suggesting this, but 4-piece Shimenawa is actually decent on him. 50% damage buff is pretty insane, and though you won't be able to burst with him as much, if ever at all, it can actually be pretty solid personal damage. Alternatively, you'll be playing him with a shield a majority of the time, so the retracing Bolide set that gives you damage bonus when you have a shield up can be pretty dang strong. If for some reason you have a good 4-piece set of echoes, you can also use that since it'll buff your normal attacks, but keep in mind your burst and charged attacks will suffer. I don't personally recommend farming this one, but if you have the set and you don't want to farm something new, it can work. In a more general sense, I recommend Desert Pavilion Chronicle for hypercarry Scaramouche, or just if you have a Viridescent user on your team already, but if you don't, then I recommend 4-piece Viridescent. 4 Bolide is okay, and if you're feeling extra devious, you can use 4-piece Shimenawa, since most people will have a decent set of that if they've farmed Emblem. Worst case scenario, you can always use a mix of 2-piece sets from these, or Wander is true, no pun intended. To recap, you want an attack percent sands, animo damage goblet, and crit damage or crit rate circlet. And for substats, lastly, just go for your standard energy recharge, crit, attack percent, and elemental mastery. Best of luck to you if you're farming Pavilion. Like Mr. Moosh's artifacts here, there's a bit of nuance to his weapons, so let's talk about those next. Because Wanderer is a damage dealer, he has a ton of catalyst options. His best options can vary by the team, so I want to try and go over why each weapon is good for him. First off, the sequel to the Bell, Bell 2, is his signature weapon, and the signature weapon is his theoretical best in slot. The reason is it's tailor-made for him, increasing his normal attack speed and buffing normal attacks after using his skill. However, if you play him in a team that's meant to deal high AoE damage like this triple Animo team with Venti, this weapon could hypothetically lose its throne as the best in slot weapon. The reason is the passive basically does nothing for charged attacks, and if you're spamming charged attacks, there's weapons that'll give him more value. It's not a bad weapon, it's just conditional whether or not it's going to be his best in slot based on the content or team you're running, but a majority of the time it's his best weapon. The next best option is going to be, you're gonna love this one, Memory of Dust. You're almost always going to be playing him with a shield, and with a shield, the stats the weapon gives are insane. Shield strength and 40% bonus attack on top of the weapon's regular stats make it crazy good on him, and I highly recommend it. Unshielded, this weapon is still pretty strong on him, but you'll play a shield on him a lot of the time anyways, so it's pretty good. Lost Prayer is also amazing due to the stats it gives and him being able to get a couple of stacks of elemental damage bonus while on the field. If you don't have any of those 5-star options, you could opt for the Widsith, which is a giga buffing 4-star crit damage book. 2/3 of the buffs on him are amazing, and the elemental mastery buff can still add quite a bit of damage if he's swirling, so I highly recommend Widsith as a backup. Solar Pearl at Refinement 5 is good and actually can be better than Kagura's Verity. Kagura's seems like it would be good, but the problem is it gives skill damage, and his skill converts into normal and charged attack damage, so he's not actually getting all of the benefits of Kagura's Verity. Skyward Atlas is solid as well, and then we come to the first free-to-play option, which is Blackcliff. Blackcliff is a crit damage weapon available for Star Glitter, and it's basically just a stat stick. Lastly, you have the option of Low Refinement Solar Pearl, Dodoco Tails, and worst case, you can use Eye of Perception or the craftable Frostbearer. I really don't recommend using Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers or Prototype Amber on him, just because he's meant to do on-field damage, and those two weapons are pretty weak for normal scaling damage dealers. Unfortunately, Wanderer doesn't have that many great free-to-play friendly weapon options. However, the damage you're getting in exchange for having access to some of these weapons is really solid. Next up, I'm going to teach you how to build strong teams for Wanderer. Wanderer is one of the most flexible characters in Genshin Impact, and by that I mean he can just be played with so many different characters because of the nature of his kit. That is with the exception of shields, because he basically needs a shield in every single team comp. There's not a lot of content where you won't need some sort of stagger resistance or shield, but outside of that he's very flexible. Now there's basically two core teams that you want to think of when you're thinking of Wanderer. You have the option of Wanderer and 3 flex characters that can sort of work together to buff Wanderer or to just be a solid off-field damaging team, or you can play Wanderer with Faruzan and use him as a hyper carry. Now mixing these teams can be okay, but you usually want to focus on one or the other. The best example I can think of for the first one with 3 flex spots is just inserting Wanderer into a taser team with Xingqiu, Fischl, and Beidou. This sort of team is really good because it allows you to shield up Wanderer and give him some damage resistance with Xingqiu and also some stagger resistance as well, and that'll basically make it so you're not going to really get interrupted in the sky, which allows Wanderer to deal really high animo damage, swirl, electrocharge, all that really good stuff. You can also opt to do another classic like National with Wanderer, where you can just go ahead and slot Xingqiu, Bennett, and someone like Xiangling, and basically Xiangling's Pyronado is going to deal high pyro damage. You're going to also have Hydra on enemies, you're going to be swirling around, and there's basically no way you can go wrong with these units. However, a more fun way to play Wanderer, and what I found to be very effective as well, is to use him as a hyper carry with Faruzan. Now I'm gonna be honest, Faruzan, guys, is honestly really not that good at C0. I have her at C0, I've had her at C0 this entire video. I haven't activated her Constellations because C6 is a different unit from C0, and I wanted to find a way to use her with Wanderer. Now the way that I found is to also have Venti to help battery her. That's been the biggest issue with Faruzan, is getting her energy. Wanderer is not going to really help with that. She's not going to do that herself. So you also have to use Venti and use Favonius on this team. But in this example, I went ahead and I used Bennett because Bennett's field will affect him even when he's in the air. Use Faruzan to lower enemy resistances. Use Venti with attack, animo damage, and crit, so that way he's able to benefit from the animo resistance shred, and then also have Wanderer. And what effectively this allows you to do is group up enemies and spam charge attacks and deal just tons of damage in a pretty decent area. Alternatively though, you could flex Venti for tons of different other characters. Like if you wanted a shielder, you could use Toma here, and you would get the pyro resonance from Bennett and Toma together. Alternatively, you could pull out someone like Layla, and Layla's going to be right here. She's going to give you the cryo buff and increase Wanderer's crit damage while also shielding you. This third spot is pretty flexible in this team because Bennett and Faruzan are the core that's going to carry most of Wanderer's damage. Alternatively, if you don't want to make him a hyper carry, you can do something nutty like this reverse melt burning team, where you're going to constantly be getting pyro applied to enemies, and Nahida's going to be proccing Dendro, so you'll constantly have burning. Rosaria will do some reverse melting, and Wanderer's going to be dealing solid damage while also having protection from Toma. You also have the option of going the hyper carry route with Yunjin and Zhongli, where you get the Geo resonance, so that way you get the damage bonus, shield strength, and you're also using Yunjin for normal attack damage bonus, and you have Bennett. There's really just so many ways you can play Wanderer and different teams that you can put together. Now the only thing that you really need to think about avoiding is characters that are going to take up a lot of field time on their own. For example, you wouldn't really get benefit out of running someone like Child with this team. The reason being that Child is a character that's really selfish and wants a lot of field time. You can just use his burst, but the thing is he wants all that field time so that way he can deal Riptide damage and just kill a bunch of enemies because he's got an insatiable bloodlust. But Wanderer also wants that time. Characters like Ganyu that can apply cryo off field can also be good with Wanderer. Characters like Jean, who have an attack speed buff at Constellation 2 and have animo resistance shred at C4, can also be good. There's a lot of flexibility with this character. You can also play him in a freeze setup as well, and freeze can be pretty good. I don't know where my freeze went. Here it is. There's just so many ways to run Wanderer and get good value, and you don't have to use Faruzan. In fact, if you don't have C6 Faruzan, I actually don't recommend recommend running Faruzan, unless you're running this exact team where you're going to be able to battery Faruzan with Venti as well. For reference, I have 298% energy recharge on Faruzan with Favonius, and it's still not enough. So I had too many things to say about this, and I knew if I scripted it out, it would just take way too long. So I hope this general team building advice helped you with Wanderer a little bit. And if not, I'll try to answer some questions in the comments, but just know he's really flexible as far as teams go. Next up, I want to talk about his constellations because we have a lot to say about these. Wanderer's constellations are decent, but there's a hard stopping point I'd recommend if you're not going for C6. First off, his C1 gives him a 10% bonus to his attack speed and his skill, and his passive that fires off anemo arrows gets an extra 25% of his attack as bonus damage. It's a pretty solid buff, not game changing, but pretty good. As far as C2, it gives a massive damage bonus to his burst when you use it towards the end of his skill's stamina bar. Essentially, the more points that you've used, the more damage bonus you get, which can be a solid damage increase. His C3 increases his burst level by 3 as well. Constellation 4 on Scaramouche seems complicated, but it's pretty straightforward. Basically, you'll gain an extra elemental buff from his passive. It doesn't stack to make his passive stronger or anything, it will just grant you a random one when you use his skill. This can be good or bad depending on RNG, and ultimately, it's pretty mid for the price point. C5 increases his skill by 3, which is pretty alright, and his C6 is a solid damage increase, with him getting bonus normal attack blades when a normal attack makes contact with an enemy, and his elemental skill stamina regenning slowly when he gets to half. The stamina regen doesn't make a huge difference because for most of his rotations, you won't need a ton of extra time, but overall this constellation can add a lot of damage when played with attack speed buffs, which is what a lot of his kit revolves around. Overall, Wanderer's constellations are decent, but they're not insanely game-changing like Raiden or Yaimiko. If you're going for constellations, I'd recommend stopping at 2 or 3, but as always, my stance on constellations is that unless they're your favorite character, you can always use those extra fates to get another character instead of a copy. That being said, do whatever you want, I don't really care. His constellations are decent, they're just not broken, but I do want to tell you guys what I think of him at C0. Wanderer makes an awesome addition to the Anemo roster. Being the first character with aerial combat is awesome enough, but the fact that his damage is also pretty solid, it makes him a character that is definitely worth going for if you enjoy Anemo units, if you're looking for an Anemo carry, or just a new DPS to play. He's not going to be a game-breaking unit, but he's pretty good, and he's fun, and lore-wise, a lot of people really like him. Also, he's pretty flexible. You can play him with a ton of different characters, and though his weapons aren't necessarily the most free-to-play friendly, there's a pretty solid fun factor of being able to just play the characters that you want with him. He actually reminds me a little bit of Hazo, and if you enjoy Hazo, you'll probably like him. That said, if you're looking at it from strictly a meta standpoint, there are definitely better characters you can pick up, but he's not a bad pickup, and he's definitely fan favorite. So with that in mind, I actually do think C0 Wanderer is pretty solid. If you guys have enjoyed this video, or if it's taught you anything, make sure to like down below so that YouTube knows the video doesn't suck. Consider checking out my other socials. I go live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone. I have a Twitter, we have a Discord. Those things are all going to be linked in the pinned comment. I wish you all the best of luck with your Wanderer polls, and next up, you're going to be seeing some TCG videos from me. Until next time.